The stagecoach left Eleanor Vale in a white cut of road, with one carpetbag, one hatbox, and snow packed hard around the hem of her brown traveling skirt. The driver did not climb down. He kept both hands on the reins, and his chin sunk into his collar. The horses blew steam through their nostrils, stamping at the frozen ruts like they wanted no part of Bitterroot Valley after dark. "That there's the McCall place," he said. Eleanor followed his nod. A low cabin crouched beyond a run of black pines. Smoke came thin from the chimney, bent flat by the wind. Behind it, the land rolled pale and empty toward a wall of stone hills. Snow scraped sideways over the ground, dry as ground glass. The driver tossed her trunk down. It struck the road and split one corner. "I was paid to bring you here. Not inside." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her carpetbag. The wool of her glove had worn through at the thumb. Cold bit the skin there until it stung. "Is Mr. McCall expecting me?" The driver looked toward the cabin window, where one square of firelight burned. "He paid for a wife, didn't he?" He slapped the reins before she could answer. The coach lurched, wheels grinding, and was swallowed by snow and dusk. Eleanor stood alone until the wind shoved her forward. By the time she reached the cabin porch, her breath came sharp and broken. She lifted one hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood. Silas McCall filled the frame. He was taller than she had pictured from the letters. Broader, too. His beard was dark and rough along his jaw, and a scar ran from the edge of his left brow down across his cheek, pale and raised like a rope burn. One eye watched her plain. The other seemed fixed a little past her, cold and gray under the shadow of his hat. He said nothing. Eleanor swallowed. Snow had melted on her lashes. "I am Eleanor Vale." His gaze dropped to her cracked trunk, then to her boots, thin and torn at the seams. "You're late." His voice sounded as if it had not been used much. The road washed out near Stevens Pass. He stepped aside. The cabin struck her first by its heat. Real heat. Not the thin kind found in station houses, but deep stove heat that reached under wet sleeves and into bone. Cornbread sat in a black pan near the hearth, its top split golden. Coffee steamed on the stove. A bearskin hung by the door, stiff with old snowmelt. The place smelled of wood smoke, wool, and fresh bread. Silas shut the door against the storm. Eleanor stood on the plank floor, not knowing where a purchased bride was meant to put her hands. A table had been set for two. Tin plates, one knife each, a crock of beans, butter softening in a chipped blue dish. Silas took her wet carpetbag without asking and set it near the hearth. Then he crossed to a peg on the wall, pulled down the thickest sheepskin blanket, and held it out. She hesitated. His scar pulled when his jaw tightened. "Take it." She did. The wool smelled of smoke and cedar. She wrapped it around her shoulders and her hands disappeared in its weight. A long minute passed with only the fire popping sap. "I can sleep in the chair," he said. Eleanor looked at the narrow bed against the far wall, then at the chair beside the hearth, with its split cane seat. "This is your house." His eyes moved to the window. "Not much of one." "It is more than I had this morning." That made him look back. Something shifted in his face, small and gone quick. He turned away before it could settle. "Eat while it's hot." They sat across from each other. The cornbread broke rough under Eleanor's fingers. She had not eaten since dawn, but the first bite stuck in her throat. Silas did not watch her eat. He kept his eyes on his plate shoulders, bent as though he expected the roof to come down. On the shelf behind him sat a Bible, a tin cup full of nails, and a pair of small boots with the soles half mended. Eleanor's gaze caught on them. Silas followed it. "They ain't yours," he said. "Old pair." She lowered her eyes. Outside, the wind shoved hard at the walls. The cabin groaned. Somewhere beneath the floor, a loose board tapped again and again. Then came another sound. Hooves. Silas went still. The spoon in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. His head turned toward the door, and the gray in his eyes sharpened. Eleanor set down her bread. 3 horses pulled up outside. Men's boots hit the porch. Spurs scraped. A fist hammered the door once. Then the door burst inward. Snow blew across the floor in a white sheet. A man in a fur-collared coat stepped in, smiling. He had Silas's dark hair, but none of his weight. His face was clean soft around the mouth, and his eyes moved over Eleanor like she was livestock brought in for sale. Behind him came a round-bellied man with a mayor's sash beneath his coat and a deputy carrying iron cuffs. Well, now, the first man said. Brother went and bought himself a witness. Silas rose slow. Gideon McCall pulled off one glove finger by finger. Ain't no call for growling. We come legal. The mayor brushed snow from his sleeves and placed a folded paper on the table right beside Eleanor's plate. The red territorial seal had cracked in the cold. Eleanor stared at it. Silas did not touch it. Gideon leaned close enough that the smell of tobacco and wet horse came with him. Court found you unfit, Silas. Dangerous to yourself and others. Same as we told him. The fire snapped loud. The deputy shifted his grip on the cuffs. Eleanor reached for the paper. Her fingers left damp marks on the fold. She opened it and saw lines of law signatures and one word that made the room tilt smaller. Incompetent. The mayor cleared his throat. Silas McCall is hereby remanded to the county asylum pending permanent civil guardianship. All land, water, mineral, and grazing rights to be placed under temporary administration. Gideon smiled at the last word. Administration. Silas's hands hung at his sides. Big hands. Scarred hands. The knuckles white under old cuts. Eleanor looked from the paper to him. He did not look back. The mayor lifted his chin. We leave tonight. No, Eleanor said. Every man in the room turned. Her voice had come out small, but her chair legs scraped loud as she stood. Gideon laughed under his breath. That contract of yours don't make you a lawyer, Mrs. McCall. Silas flinched at the name. The deputy stepped forward. Silas moved then fast enough that Eleanor saw the deputy's hand twitch toward his gun. But Silas only put himself between her and the men. She stays out of this. Gideon's smile thinned. Too late for that. The mayor nodded. The cuffs opened with a hard iron click. Eleanor still held the court paper. The seal bled red wax against her palm. On the table, the cornbread cooled. Snow hissed where it touched the hearthstones. Silas turned his head just enough for her to see the scar along his cheek. Don't fight them, he said. Then he gave his wrists to the iron. The deputy locked the cuffs too tight. Eleanor saw it in the way Silas's fingers curled once, then went still. No sound came out of him. Not when the iron bit skin. Not when Gideon took his hat from the peg and set it crooked on his own head. Not when the mayor folded the court order and slid it back into his coat like a paid receipt. Snow blew through the open door and crawled across the floorboards. Silas looked once at Eleanor. Not long. Just enough to leave something with her. Then he ducked his head and stepped out into the storm. Eleanor followed as far as the porch. The cold hit her throat hard. 2 lanterns swung beside the wagon, throwing yellow cuts over Silas's shoulders as the deputy shoved him onto the rear bench. There were bars over the windows. A county prisoner wagon, not a carriage, not a lawful escort, a cage on wheels. Gideon mounted beside the driver and turned back toward the cabin. You best keep warm, sister. This valley eats strays. The wagon lurched. Silas sat with his wrists chained between his knees. Snow settled in his hair. His face stayed turned forward, but his hands worked once slow, as if remembering they had no use left. Eleanor stood barefoot in one torn boot and one stocking foot. She had not known the sole of her right boot had split clean across until the cold came through it. She looked down. The boot was whole. Both were. The seams had been pulled tight with black waxed thread. The broken leather patched from inside. The heel nailed firm with small, even taps. A man with those burned and scarred hands had held her boot under lamplight while she slept, mending what she had tried to hide. The wagon wheels cut down the white road. Eleanor's mouth opened, but the wind took whatever she meant to say. The last lantern vanished between the pines. Inside, the cabin had not changed. Fire in the hearth, beans on the table, cornbread cooling beside the cracked red wax mark. But the chair across from her sat pushed back empty, and that emptiness seemed larger than the room. She closed the door. The latch shook under her hand. For a time she did nothing but stand there, in Silas's sheepskin blanket, with snow melting off her hem and running in dark lines onto the floor. Then her eyes went to the paper shelf. The court order had not been the only thing the men brought in. Near the door where Gideon had stood, a smear of mud marked the boards. Beside it lay a folded scrap of brown tracing paper, half tucked under the bearskin rug. Eleanor bent and picked it up. At first it looked like nothing but bad lines. Rough hills, a creek bed, a mark for the old mine shaft north of the pasture. Then she carried it to the lamp. Her shoulders drew tight. The lines were not pasture lines. They were strata. She turned the paper, held it nearer the light. There, beneath a ridge marked Stone Valley Fault, someone had shaded a wide blue run under Silas's land. Not creek water, not spring runoff. Deep water. A buried basin big enough to feed a town. Eleanor set the paper on the table and opened the old desk under the window. Bills, tax notices, a land patent, a grazing map, receipts for timber. Her fingers moved faster, finding dates, seals, survey numbers. Outside, the wind thudded against the wall. She found a doctor's report next. Silas McCall suffers fits of violent confusion since the mine collapse. The ink was too new. The physician's name was signed in a hand Eleanor knew from territorial records in Helena. Dr. Amos Vale had been dead 9 months. The report was false. She pulled another paper free. Petition for guardianship. Filed by Gideon McCall. Witnessed by Mayor Hollis Pike. Attached claim Water and Mineral Administration pending competency ruling. Water. There it was. Not madness, not care, not safety. Water. Eleanor looked toward the window. In the black glass she saw herself wrapped in Silas's blanket hair, loose cheeks white from the cold, one hand still gripping the dead doctor's lie. Far down the road, no lantern showed now. If that wagon crossed the county line, Silas would be locked behind stone before any judge with clean hands could hear his name. Eleanor took the map, the false report, and the land patent. She laid them flat beside the lamp. Then she saw the pair of small boots on the shelf. Not hers, Silas had said. Old pair. She lifted one. Child-sized. The leather was cracked with age. Inside on the tongue, someone had cut 3 letters. M. M. McCall. A little grave marker hung in the silence between the rafters. Eleanor set the boot down as if it could bruise. The whole valley had called him mad, and he had still made bread for a woman with nowhere to go. She reached for Silas's wolfskin coat. By dawn, one of them would be caged. By dawn, the other would be riding into the teeth of the law. Eleanor found Silas's horse in the lean-to, half hid behind snow. The animal was a rangy black gelding with one torn ear and no liking for strangers. He rolled his eye when she came near, then struck boards hard enough to shake frost from the rafters. Easy, Eleanor said. Her breath came in white pulls. She had ridden office ponies, not half-wild ranch stock with winter in their lungs. But she had copied survey plats by lamplight, while men laughed over her shoulder. She had indexed land grants for clerks who thought a woman's hand was made for cups and linens. She had spent 3 years in the governor's records room learning the shape of law by the smell of ink and dust, and Gideon McCall had dropped the wrong paper on the wrong floor. She saddled the gelding with fingers stiff as broom handles. The wolfskin coat swallowed her nearly to the knees. In Silas's desk she found a telegraph blank and the emergency form used for territorial stays. She wrote by the lamp until the nib tore through paper. Fraudulent competency claim. Forged medical record. Federal land and water patent under dispute. Immediate stay required. At the bottom she signed the name Bitterroot Valley would not know. Eleanor Vale, former assistant keeper, Territorial Land Office. She folded the papers inside oilcloth, tucked them beneath her bodice, and led the gelding into the storm. The first mile near broke her. Snow came sideways so thick, the trees showed and vanished like black ribs. The gelding fought the bit whenever ice slapped his face. Once he slid on buried stone and Eleanor's knee struck the saddle horn hard enough to send sparks behind her eyes. She did not turn back. At Pike's Crossing, the telegraph office was dark. She banged the door until Mr. Tully opened in his nightshirt, one hand holding a lamp, the other a poker. "Good Lord, girl, send this to Missoula, Federal Marshal's office." Then Helena, governor's desk, his eyes narrowed. At this hour. You got money." Eleanor pulled off her glove and laid Silas's wedding ring on the counter. Plain iron, too large for her finger, warm from her fist. Tully looked at the ring. Then at her face, he took the paper. The telegraph key began its sharp clatter, thin as sleet on tin, but each tap cut farther than any horse could run. Eleanor was back in the saddle before the reply came. She rode north toward the county road. The prisoner wagon had slowed near Dead Man's Shelf where the road narrowed between cliff and timber. One wheel had sunk deep in a drift. The deputy cursed at the horses. Gideon stood stamping his boots. Silas sat behind the bars, his head lifted first. Eleanor rode out of the white dark and pulled the gelding crosswise before the team. The driver saw her too late. The lead horses screamed and reared. Chains snapped taut. Lantern lights swung wild over snow-iron faces. Gideon stepped forward. "Have you lost what little sense you came with?" Eleanor pulled the oilcloth from her coat. Her hand shook once, then stopped. The sheriff leaned from the wagon seat. "Move aside, ma'am." "No." Silas gripped the bars. "Eleanor." She kept her eyes on the sheriff. "This man cannot cross county line under present order. Federal question has been raised." Gideon laughed, but no one joined him. Eleanor unfolded the stay and held it high enough for the lantern to catch the red seal. Emergency injunction filed by telegraph with Missoula and Helena. Any officer moving him now makes himself party to fraud. The sheriff's mouth worked under his mustache. Gideon snatched for the paper. Eleanor jerked it back. "Touch it, and I name you first." For one long breath only, the wind moved. Then Silas spoke from the cage, voice scraped raw. "You came back." Eleanor turned. Snow clung to his beard. Blood marked one wrist beneath the iron. His eyes held on her like a man seeing lamplight after years underground. She pressed the paper into the sheriff's glove. "Turn the wagon around," she said. "The law wants him breathing in court by morning." By morning, the saloon had been made into a courtroom. The faro tables were shoved against the walls. The bar was covered with Ledger's ink bottles and one brass scale borrowed from the assay office. Sawdust lay wet near the door, where boots had tracked in snow and horse slush. The whole room smelled of sour whiskey, coal smoke, damp wool, and men packed too close. Silas stood inside an iron holding cage set beside the stove. The heat did not reach him. His wrists were chained in front. One cuff had rubbed skin raw. He kept his shoulders low, as if too much height would give men cause to strike him down. Mayor Hollis Pike sat behind the largest table with a judge's Bible before him, though he was no judge. Gideon stood at his right shoulder, clean shirt, combed hair, Silas's hat still on his head. Eleanor stood alone by the door. Her skirt was stiff with frozen mud. One sleeve of Silas's wolfskin coat had torn at the seam. She carried a roll of maps tied with boot leather. The mayor looked her up and down. "Mrs. McCall," he said, and let the room hear how little he thought of the name. "This is a civil competency hearing, not a kitchen quarrel." A few men laughed. Eleanor walked forward. Her wet boots made dark marks across the boards. Gideon leaned on the table. "You can read, I grant you that. But reading a law book don't give a mail-order bride standing." Silas's hands closed around the bars. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. His face looked carved from winter. "Leave this room, no. They won't stop with me. I know." His fingers tightened until one split knuckle opened again. Blood ran down the bar in a thin line. "Go home," he said. Eleanor looked at him for half a breath. "I have none unless you walk out with me." The saloon went quiet enough for the stove to be heard ticking. She laid the first map on the table and cut the leather tie with Gideon's own knife from the evidence pile. "This is the original land patent for the McCall Ranch, signed and sealed 18 years ago. It grants surface grazing timber spring and subterranean water rights to Silas McCall." Mayor Pike tapped his finger. "Irrelevant." Eleanor laid down the second map. "This was dropped last night by Mr. Gideon McCall. It is not a ranch map. It is a basin survey. See the blue shading under Stone Valley Fault." Men leaned in. Gideon's jaw shifted. Eleanor pointed to the lines. "That is deep water. Enough to feed Bitterroot for 50 years. Enough to sell to rail camps, mines, and every dry ranch east of here." The mayor's face reddened above his collar. "Speculation. No." She pulled out the medical report. "This is speculation." She held it so the nearest juror could see. "Dr. Amos Vale signed this report claiming Silas McCall was unfit after the mine collapse." A gray-haired rancher squinted. "Looks signed." Eleanor nodded. "It does. My father taught me his hand. He also died last spring." No one laughed then. Her voice stayed flat, but the paper trembled at the corner. "This report is dated October. A dead man wrote no such thing." The jurors looked from the paper to the mayor. Silas did not move. His eyes had gone to the floor, where a small puddle of melted snow sat under his boots. Eleanor turned one page. "Gideon McCall filed guardianship 3 days after this false report. Mayor Pike witnessed it. The same petition asks temporary administration of water and mineral rights. Not cattle, not medicine, water." A murmur rose. The blacksmith stood. "That why you been buying up dry lots, Pike?" Another man said. "My well tax went double last month." The mayor slammed his palm on the table. "Sit down." Nobody did. Eleanor placed the forged report beside the basin map. They did not mean to help a sick man. They meant to bury a sane one behind stone walls and take what was under his feet. The room broke open. Chairs scraped. Men shouted. Gideon backed toward the bar. Then Mayor Pike drew his pistol. The sound of the hammer cocking cut through every voice. 2 deputies stepped from the back hall and barred the doors. Pike's eyes fixed on Eleanor, and the pistol did not shake. "Burn the papers," he said. "Or we start with the woman." The saloon held its breath. Pike's pistol stayed on Eleanor's chest. The muzzle was black and small, no wider than a thimble, yet every eye in the room had gone to it. Behind her, the deputies kept their backs to the doors. Gideon stood near the bar, one hand pressed over his vest pocket, where the folded water deed made a square against the cloth. "Burn the papers," Pike said again. Eleanor looked down at the maps. The basin survey, the land patent, the dead doctor's lie. All of it lay spread on the table close enough to the stove that heat had curled one corner of the tracing paper. Her fingers moved toward the roll. Silas hit the bars once. Not loud. Just iron under flesh. No. Pike turned the pistol toward him. You had your turn, madman. Silas's hands closed around two cage bars. His shoulders rose slow. The old iron gave a small cry where it met the floor. Let her walk. Pike smiled without teeth. Ain't nobody walking till those papers are ash. He pulled a match from his pocket and struck it on the table edge. The flame came up blue, then yellow. Eleanor smelled sulfur. Her right hand closed over the false medical report. Her left slid beneath the basin map, feeling for the small packet she had tucked there before the hearing. A telegraph receipt. Missoula confirmed. Marshall dispatched. But paper was not boots on a floor. Pike reached across the table and touched the match to the corner of the map. Fire took quick. A thin orange line ran along the dry edge. Eleanor slapped it with her bare palm. The flame bit her skin. She did not pull back. Pike grabbed her wrist. Silas moved. The cage bars bent with a shriek that tore through the saloon. One bolt ripped out of the floor. The stovepipe rattled. Men stumbled back. Silas drove his shoulder through the gap, tearing his coat on the iron. The chain still hung from his wrists, but he came out low and hard like a bull breaking winter fence. A deputy lifted his rifle. The blacksmith caught the barrel and shoved it toward the rafters. No. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. Pike shoved Eleanor aside and thrust the burning map toward the stove. Silas put both hands over the fire. The smell changed at once. Hot skin, charred wool, burning paper caught under his palms. His jaw locked. A cord stood out in his neck. He pressed down until the orange edge died beneath his hands. Eleanor seized the map and pulled it free. Silas stepped in front of her. Pike's pistol rose to his chest. Silas did not look at the gun. He looked at Eleanor over his shoulder with smoke coming off his hands. I told you, he said. Always. The words landed in the room like a nail driven clean through oak. Pike's finger tightened. Then the front doors burst inward. Cold daylight crashed across the floor. Snow blew in around 6 men in long coats with federal stars on their chests. Boots struck hard. Carbines came up. One marshal with a gray beard and tired eyes stepped ahead. Drop it, Pike. Pike swung the pistol. The marshal did not blink. I said, drop it. For a second, the whole valley hung on one finger. Then Gideon moved first. He bolted for the back hall. The blacksmith caught him by the collar and threw him over a card table. The water deed slid from his vest and landed face up in the sawdust. Pike's pistol clattered to the floor. A marshal kicked it away. Eleanor's knees gave once. She caught the table edge. Silas turned fast, but the chain checked him. He stood there with burned hands open, unable to touch her. The gray-bearded marshal picked up the telegraph receipt, then the forged report. Mrs. McCall Eleanor lifted her chin. Yes. He looked at Silas, at the broken cage, at the map, still smoking at the edge. Ma'am, looks like we got here near late. Eleanor looked at Silas's hands, then at his face. No, she said. You got here before they buried him twice. The marshal unlocked Silas's cuffs in the middle of the saloon. The iron came loose and struck the floor with a dead sound. Silas looked down at his wrists as if he did not trust them to be his own. Red rings circled the skin. His burned palms hung open, blackened at the lines. Eleanor reached for him, then stopped, seeing the flesh. His eyes moved to her hand. Don't look. She took his wrist anyway. Outside, Pike and Gideon were led through the snow with their hands bound before them. The mayor's sash dragged in the slush behind him. Gideon's fine coat had torn at the shoulder. He did not look like a man of law then. He looked like a thief caught in daylight. The townsfolk stood along the road in silence. No cheering came, only boots shifting, hats coming off. eyes lowered when Silas passed. The blacksmith stepped forward first. "Silas." Silas stopped. The man swallowed his beard stiff with frost. "I put my name to that hearing paper. Pike said you'd near killed a man in the mine." Silas said nothing. The blacksmith took off his hat. "I didn't ask you." One by one, men who had crossed the street from him for years looked at the ground. A woman from the dry goods store pressed a folded cloth into Eleanor's hand. "For his burns," she said. Eleanor took it. Silas walked on. Not proud, not bowed, just walking. By the time they reached the cabin, afternoon had turned the snow blue in the low places. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight now that the storm had spent itself. The broken corner of Eleanor's trunk still sat near the porch steps. Her boot prints from the night before had filled with new snow, but Silas's large tracks remained under them, half-covered, leading to the shed and back. Inside, the fire had gone low. Eleanor stirred it until sparks woke in the coals. She put water on the stove, then found the tin of salve yarrow and clean linen in the cupboard. Silas sat in the chair he had meant to sleep in, his big frame too still for it. She knelt before him. Hands. He held them out after a long pause. The burns were ugly, blistered across the heel of each palm. Ash had settled deep in the cracks of his skin. Eleanor wet the cloth. Her own palm stung where fire had kissed it, but she did not make a sound. She cleaned his hands slow. Every time the cloth touched raw flesh, Silas's fingers flexed and stopped. "You ought to curse," she said. "Forgot how. You remember how to make cornbread." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The cabin answered with small things, water ticking in the kettle, fire licking a split log wind, rubbing soft at the chinks between logs. No boots on the porch, no iron at the door, no man coming to take what was his. Eleanor wrapped the last strip of linen around his palm and tied it with her teeth. Silas watched her as though each motion had to be learned. "My brother buried my wife and boy," he said at last. Eleanor's hands went still. The mind took them first. Then folks took the rest. Said grief made me wild. Said quiet meant crazy. After a while, a man quits answering. She looked toward the shelf. The small boots sat there, patched with care no child would ever wear again. "I saw them," she said. Silas drew in one hard breath. It shook once and left him. "I did not know what to do with the house after. Couldn't leave it. Couldn't live in it." Eleanor tied the second bandage. "Then we will teach it." He looked at her. She stood crossed to her broken trunk and pulled out the only thing that had not been damaged, a small blue cup wrapped in a stocking. She set it on the table beside his tin one. 2 cups. Silas stared at them. The firelight caught his scar, but it did not harden his face now. It softened the worn places, made him look less like stone and more like a man who had been left in weather too long. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. His bandaged hand rose rough and careful. She put her fingers in it. He held them like something breakable and needed. "Thank you for coming back." She sat beside him, shoulder touching shoulder, while the cabin warmed around them. Outside, Bitterroot Valley lay white and wide under the last light. Inside, 2 castaways listened to the fire and did